Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at 10 o'clock Eastern Time, and this is Starfleet Tactical. I am Chris Weave. I've got Lissa producing the show behind the scenes. I don't know if she's going to come on or not. We actually didn't talk about whether she was going to come on or not because she's actually got something else she's doing too. So
hi, I'm playing in a community night for one of the communities I'm a part of. We're playing Among Us, so I'm keeping an eye on all of you. But I'm also playing a video game at the moment.
But before you run away, last week we had some technical issues, and I figured out what the problem was. You know what the problem was? The problem was at no point while we were on did I say that I speak only for my employer, or I don't speak for my employer. I speak only for myself.
That was clearly the issue.
Yes, it caused such a disturbance in the space-time continuum that we had a problem.
Yep.
Well, that must have been it. So in reality, what happened last week, everybody, is I periodically have. Bye, Lissa. I periodically have some minor heart issues. I've got AFib, and in addition to that, I'm still anemic. In fact, I had some medical tests done, and despite the fact that I've been taking an iron supplement for 2 months, my numbers are pretty much the same as they were before. So I have some specialists in my future. The reason why I'm willing to talk about my medical condition online is because I really sort of consider myself to be a medical success story. And by that, I mean, I have symptoms, I then go see a doctor, and then the doctor fixes that stuff, right? So that, the AFib stuff is probably a result of the anemia, and it's because I've had a lot of treatment for AFib, and it generally has worked pretty well. My quality of life is a lot better. But last week, I wasn't feeling particularly well, and indeed was having a little bit of a racing heartbeat, and I just felt like crap. And I just didn't have a show in me last week. So Lissa and I actually came on, and we spent about 5 minutes on the air explaining what was going on and telling you we'd be back next week. And did a little bit of banter back and forth. And then afterwards, when I went to check the show and download it, it said the show only lasted like 3 seconds. And it's like, what? And so I don't know what was going on last week, but we had a technical issue at the same time we were trying to basically cancel the show and tell you guys that we were going to come back next week. So my apologies for everybody who was confused, but we did do about 5 minutes worth of show, which we then canceled. And since it didn't take, etc., I just went ahead and deleted it and created the new one labeled episode 83 take 2. And that's what I'm going to do tonight. So Pat is not here, obviously, because if he were here, you'd be seeing him also. I believe he is on some sort of family vacation, if I remember correctly. He said that he was probably, he wasn't exactly sure what Commander-in-Chief House had prepared for him, but he was pretty sure that he wasn't going to be here. And indeed, he is not here. And he did not respond to the email message I sent him earlier today. So he's off doing some stuff. In any event, I'm going to talk about do some more Karl Lautenschlager stuff. So the general announcements, so I don't forget. So the first thing is I'm still behind in going back to the older ones and doing comments. I do intend to do that. The anemia thing has me at about 70%, and I've got a bunch of other stuff going on that's sort of prioritizing my time. I know that I can always get back to those comments eventually, and so as a result of that, I haven't gotten to the comments, and I really need to go back and do that because I think that that's important, right? That's part of the interaction that we have, is doing that. So hello to everybody who's jumping in. Hello, Donnie. Hello, Richard. Hello, Claude. Hello, Delon. How are you? No, right. I believe I already said that I don't speak for my employer. Maybe I didn't. I said that I forgot to say it last week. Maybe I didn't particularly articulate it this week, but I do not speak for my employer. So my July trip has been canceled. I was supposed to go out to Las Vegas for 2 weeks in July. For a bunch of different reasons, we concluded not to do that, not the least of which is I'm trying to do some some specialist stuff, and I don't know what the specialists are going to want me to do. And the end result of that is that I don't want to complicate the schedule. And if I'm going to travel in 2 weeks, I pretty much need to make my arrangements like immediately. If I don't make my arrangements immediately, it gets totally crazy. And so I'm not going any place in July. I'm going to be here. At least I'm not going to go away for 2 weeks and have to deal with hotel internet. So I'm thinking that next week I'll probably do a Q&A show like we did a couple of shows ago. That seemed to work really well. And so it'll be like I'm going through and I'm tearing through a bunch of naval combat stuff. That's what I've been doing lately. So it's another opportunity to ask questions. Specific, if you want to tie specific things into Star Trek or some other science fiction, please feel free. That's kind of what I'm going to do. I'm behind on watching Babylon 5, so I don't think we're going to do it in June quite like I thought we were going to. Well, given that this is the last show in June, I guess that's pretty much definite. So we'll do it in July. That's the plan, is we're going to try to do it in July. Okay, so I've been marching my way through this stuff. You'll see that I added a few things onto this list. I added Wayne Hughes, who wrote the book Fleet Tactics, Theory and Practice, which then got turned into the second edition of Fleet Tactics and Coastal Combat. And now the third edition is out, and it's called Fleet Tactics and Naval Operations. And I'll be honest, I've only read the first one, and I really kind of want to read all three. I'll probably read the first and the third, maybe. Maybe not, because I think I've got the second and third in electronic editions, but I need to read both of those. I'm thinking about adding J.C. Wiley, who is somebody who is a naval strategist, naval theorist that I have not read previously. I'm also thinking about adding Milan Vega, who I have read some of his stuff back. So when I at the Naval War College, I did the faculty by day, student by night thing. And Milan is one of the other faculty members there. So Milan was a colleague of mine, and he's somebody who wrote stuff that I read in some of my classes up there. And so he's done a lot of writing on naval tactics and stuff. And so I may or may not include that. It'll depend upon whether I think it's useful for what we're doing in this little series that I'm going through. Okay, so I did not update this slide. I just realized that I didn't update it to include the things I added, but these are the ones that I've been, I reread these on a regular basis, and I've been going through all this stuff, and so that's the plan. I'm still marching through all this stuff, and the reason why I'm doing this is because I think these are excellent illustrations on how to think about naval combat. I am not suggesting that you should just simply, if you're writing science fiction, file off the serial numbers and add in space on the end and convert World War II naval fleet into a science fiction equivalent thereof. But what I'm saying is that if you want to make your stuff read like it's sui generis, read like it comes from the background, it's helpful to be able to know how to think about how naval combat works and the differences between surface Navy combat and combat and out in space, et cetera. And I'm trying to give you all the tools on how to think about that. And you can use those tools to think about Star Trek, and you can use those tools to think about other science fiction. So, but like I always try to say anyway, I'm not suggesting that you should not like something that you currently like. That's not my purpose in this. I'm just trying to make everybody an educated consumer. So the plan for tonight is to go back to Karl Lautenschlager, who I talked about last week. Last week I did his, it was mostly his article, The Dreadnought Revolution Reconsidered, which is something that was done for a symposium at the U.S. Naval Academy. And it was mostly about the revolution in ships. Now I'm going back to his second article, Technology and the Evolution of Naval Warfare, which is really more about how the revolution in fleets took place. Now, he talks about some of this. There's some overlap, right? Because the ships are part of a fleet. But in that first one, he really talked about dreadnought gunnery, and he talked about the development of torpedo boat destroyers, how torpedo boats turned into torpedo boat destroyers turned into destroyers. This is really more about the big picture, about how it all fits together. And in this one, he goes all the way through to the current time period when he wrote it, which was the early 1980s. And so I'm going to do a little bit more emphasis on the earlier part that's sort of about surface combat. But I'll cover some of that later stuff as well. And so that's what I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about. So this is the slide that I included the last time, a revolution in naval combat. Now, you'll see that I spelled revolution, evolution together kind of weird. And the reason why I do that is the real lesson of Lautenschlager is that evolutionary changes in what is deployed, what's being used, etc. Evolutionary improvements lead to revolutionary changes. He makes the argument that that the technological watershed of the HMS Dreadnought was by implementing new technology, but that's just not true. The technology just really wasn't new. Some of it was stuff that they'd been working on for 100 years to try to get right. And so they were sort of moving their way towards getting it right. That was all the optical range finding stuff. Some of the other stuff was more recent vintage, but like the newest technology in the Dreadnought was about 10 years old. But 10 years made a hell of a lot of difference. When you put it together, when you integrate all those systems together, you end up with a dramatic increase in combat power. And you end up with that on the Dreadnought battleship itself. And then there was a sort of a separate set of technological revolutions that was taking place that turned the torpedo boat destroyer into the destroyer and turned it into a vital element of the battle fleet. Now he says battle line there. It's really in support of the battle line. The battle line is really the dreadnoughts themselves, but it was part of the battle fleet in a way that previous auxiliaries hadn't been. If you remember back 100 episodes ago, well, not 100 episodes, we've only done 83. Year and a half ago-ish, I talked about the history, hiding, and hydrodynamics. And part of that history was about how auxiliaries weren't part of the battle. And it was only when you got to this time period did you start having small ships that were part of main fleet actions. And that's really what we're talking about here. Okay, so now we're going to talk about fleets. And I've got this extended quote from Lautenschlager that I think is worth just going ahead and reading it. So the idea of a single technological breakthrough in the military sphere is popular mythology. It's not true. Important advances in naval weaponry have not come with the introduction of spectacular new technology, but with the integration of several known, often rather mundane inventions. Now, so far, that's pretty much what we talked about last time. That's pretty much what I've been sort of emphasizing. Developments in warship and aircraft design have tended to be evolutionary rather than revolutionary. But there have been several instances when combinations of technology were brought together to produce rapid change so significant that all existing combat fleets had to meet the new standard in fighting capabilities or remain hopelessly ineffective. Now, that's a very important point, right? What that's saying is that when there's a change like this, you either get on the bus and adopt the change yourself, or you get left behind, right? There's no such thing as, well, we're just going to decide not to participate. Or if there is, you're basically saying you're not going to be able to deal with that situation. And periodically you end up with things like the French kind of making the decision that maybe they're not going to participate on stuff. We'll just be a coastal defense force, and we'll basically give up our offensive capability. Sometimes that's all well and good, but those type of forces aren't particularly flexible, which is the real problem that I have with them. So I've added here, evolutionary development leads to revolutionary change, or can lead to revolutionary change. He goes on to say, the extent of these new capabilities was seldom reflected in obvious physical changes. So in other words, like, it's the same guns, the turrets pretty much look the same. How do you tell whether you've got one of these new ships that has this dramatically increased gunnery, or how do you tell if it's got an old ship? And if you knew what to look for, if you're an educated consumer of this sort of thing and you know what to look for, you can spot like the range finding stuff, and okay, that's a spotting top and not a fighting top, and there's the optical range finders, and later on you may recall I thought about trying to find the slides and put them on here, pictures, but there just isn't any space on this slide. You may recall when I was talking about naming and typing, 50 episodes ago, I talk about how the difference between a destroyer and a destroyer escort. And one of the big differences is a destroyer has this turret on it that doesn't have, we're talking World War II era, has this turret on it that doesn't have any guns. And that turret is where the gunnery director sits. If you look at a battleship, say, for instance, the South Dakota classes, because the USS Massachusetts, one of the South Dakotas, is the battleship that I've spent the most amount of time on. I've spent more time on that battleship than all the other battleships I've been on combined, because I used to live very near it. If you look at that ship, you'll see that there's two of these turrets up high, and then there's one or two on either side. And so the two up high are for the main guns, spotting 1 and spotting 2. And then there's Sky 1, 2, 3, 4, if I remember is how they called them, that were the ones that were doing the spotting for the smaller guns, like the 5-inch guns, etc. And they were basically used for anti-aircraft spotting, whereas the big guns were really about firing the big guns. And you had two of these turrets with their big optical range finders, big wide. They're basically binoculars where the end pieces are 10 feet apart or 15 feet apart, so that you can get very good stereoscopic vision and you can do range determination with it. All that stuff is there. There's two of those because it's a battleship. People are shooting at you. You might lose one. So, and there's one forward and one aft. And so, sometimes one would have a better view on a target than another, and they can switch back and forth between them. So then he concludes with, in sum, the key to identifying important developments for the future is to concentrate on the synthesis of different technologies and how that synthesis can produce fundamental change in mission capabilities. We talked about that last time with individual ships. Let's do that with fleets. Okay. So one of the things I'm going to do here in this is I'm going to bundle it a little bit differently than Lautenschlager did. And so on the left, we have basically the sections of the article where he's talking about stuff, and I'm combining it a little bit differently. So I encourage you all to go find this article and read it. I think maybe I scanned it from International Security. I think I maybe actually did scan it from a hard copy. But it's a great article. As you can see, I'm sort of taking the fuel stuff and moving it in with the maneuvering stuff. I'm taking aircraft and adding it into 3 medium combat, and I'm just going to skip tactical nuclear weapons because it's really I don't think it has a whole lot to offer what I'm trying to get across here for this. And so it's just I'm just going to kind of leave it by the wayside for this discussion. Okay, so auto maneuver. What do we mean by that? We mean the ability to maneuver irregardless of the wind, right? So steam engines, but it's also screw propellers. So why both? Why do you need to? I mean, because there are paddle wheels out there, right? Why aren't paddle wheels good enough? And the answer is paddle wheels are incredibly fragile. So paddle wheels gave you steam capability, but realistically, what you ended up with was a lot of auxiliaries, packet ships, mail carriers, stuff like that, that used steam paddle wheels because they were useful in some situations. But warships, they tried doing things like have armored paddle wheels. And the thing is, they're so big and the armor ends up being so thin and they're still so fragile that you poke a hole in it. Now your paddle wheel doesn't work. They then tried, sometimes you had these warships that had a paddle wheel in the center of the thing. Well, that's all well and good, except now you've only got one paddle wheel and it's in the center, and so you got a big hole in your ship, and it's just problematic too. It's just a pain. Paddle wheels are a pain. They're kind of cool. If you've ever been on a paddle wheel steamer, I mean, there's a certain, it's fun, but they're just not very good for warship. So you really kind of need screw propellers. When you got this capability, when you add steam engines, naval warfare is no longer dependent on the wind. And so at first, you only really get tactical mobility from this, right? And what do I mean by that? It's like mobility, tactical mobility is the mobility in battle. So you get speed, you get maneuverability in battle, but you don't really get strategic mobility because those early first-generation steam engines and first-generation naval steam engines, we'd been using steam engines for like 100 years before they really sort of got their act together with the screw propeller, et cetera, and they became reliable enough that you'd be willing to use one in combat. Tactical mobility gets you the ability to sort of move around, but at a cost of high fuel consumption. And so it didn't give you strategic mobility for a long, long time. If you look in the lower right-hand corner, that's HMS Warrior, which is sort of the archetypal ship of this really, really weird era where you've got a metal-hulled ship with steam power. You can, if you look in there, you can see that there are 2 smokestacks and you've got sails. So you used sails for strategic mobility to get you from place to place. That gave you the endurance that you needed to do those sorts of things. And then you used steam when you're actually in combat. So this has all sorts of implications, by the way, some of which I'm going to talk about a little bit. Like, for instance, coastal craft can be fast and maneuverable because they don't have to worry. They're only going, a short distance away from their base. They don't have to worry about coaling stations and stuff like that. So this bifurcation like this persists over time and has some follow-on effects. Like, for instance, the Germans in World War I, the Imperial German Navy was called the High Seas Fleet. Well, was it really the High Seas Fleet? I would argue that it was better named the North Sea Fleet. Why? Because it really didn't have the endurance to fight any place other than the North Sea. That was one of the big differences between the Royal Navy and the German Navy in World War I, is that the Royal Navy had built a navy that was designed to go throughout the entire world. The German Navy, and as a result, it had much better habitability. You could fix the stuff underway, et cetera, et cetera. The German Navy had, in some ways, better equipment, higher performing equipment, but they paid for that higher performing equipment by having less habitability. So the sailors were packed in tighter, and a lot of that gear, you really couldn't maintain it very well at sea. But they were a garrison force. They were only going to go to sea for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. The Royal Navy would go to sea for 6 months at a time or longer. These guys were only going to go to sea for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, and that sort of showed. Now, if you want to think about this in Star Trek terms, we unfortunately, we just don't have the history of how this all developed in Star Trek. You can kind of think in terms of tactical mobility is impulse engines and strategic mobility is warp. But I don't think that translates particularly well. I do think that it's interesting in that, if you, maybe it does translate from the standpoint that if you don't have really good impulse engines, you can get places. Like, it sort of makes me wonder if a ship that's just intended to carry passengers and isn't intended to do anything hardcore like fight a battle, whether the impulse engines are just not as capable. How much extra effort do you put into having good impulse engines? Or by the time you get to next gen, I sort of get the impression that impulse engines are so easy that you just sort of, crank them out, stick them on, and you're good. But if you go back far enough, I sort of wonder about that. So this bifurcation of, range, endurance, et cetera, continues through the modern time. If you look at the Chinese Navy, the Chinese Navy is actually much, much, much bigger than the United States Navy if you just look at number of hulls. Well, how many of those hulls have any sort of endurance? The answer is not very many of them. They've got a huge coastal force that's good for, 100 or 200 miles away from shore. But if you wanted to fight the battle in Hawaii, we can bring the entire United States Navy. They can't bring very much. And so it's, most navies today, most navies in the world do not have blue water, deep ocean capability in the same way that the United States Navy does, or the UK Royal Navy, or any of those other folks. Strategic mobility and tactical mobility combined is one of the big arguments that you get for nuclear power in submarines. It gives you both speed and endurance. It gives you the ability to and the ability to stay hidden while doing all those things. But that's an expensive thing, and getting that sort of strategic and tactical mobility has always been expensive. It fundamentally changed how navies, and hence how national power had to be implemented. A lot of the colonial efforts that took place in the 19th century were really about providing coaling stations, so that the Navy could get places. You needed to have a place where you could pull in to coal. And it led to a bigger logistics train, in terms of you had to ship coal to places and be able to have stockpiles of stuff there. Or at the very least, you had to have it go, you'd bring colliers along with the fleet, and then you go find a bay somewhere and transfer bags of coal across. And so coaling a ship, incidentally, was just nasty work. You had to, either carry the bags through hatches down, or if you were a ship like the Titanic or something like that, you had big doors on the side that you'd open up, and you'd and it was a production. This wasn't a routine thing. This was involving cranes and stuff to open these big doors that would sort of form chutes, and then you'd put the stuff in, but you still had to sort of distribute it in there. And all this coal was basically just shoveled. You'd get shoveled from a coal bunker into the boiler. Hot, nasty, horrible work. Glad we don't have to do that anymore. Okay, long-range weapons. So you started getting rifled ordnance in this time period, and rifled ordnance in the 19th century, and rifled ordnance really provided both an improved range and accuracy. So you ended up with heavier shells that could go farther because they were the barrels were rifled and the shells were spinning. They were more accurate. The end result is, you could shoot from about 600 yards out to up to potentially 2,000 yards, right? A good 3 times distance on range. Now, you couldn't necessarily hit all the way out that far. Eventually, you do get the ability to hit, but you could shoot a lot farther. This really sort of forces the adoption of iron armor, because you don't have the ability to withstand this stuff with just oak. It's just going to smash its way right through. But, the biggest of those guns can still perforate the iron armor. And so you really didn't change a whole lot. You didn't change a whole lot from the standpoint of, you're still poking holes in the bad guy's armor, your opponent's armor. So the real advantage is range and accuracy. It's not that your armor is now gonna stop the stuff, or that you've got this unique ability to poke holes in it. Once everybody armors up, which is just the logical conclusion of rifled naval ordnance. Once everybody armors up, the ability to inflict damage stays about the same. You can just do it a lot longer distance. So there's 2 different ways that you can think about armor here. You can, for a given weight and thickness of armor, you can have increased protection because the armor quality gets better over time. You get face hardened steel and this kind of steel and that kind of steel, and the armor gets better over time. And as it gets better, you can either have more protection for a given weight, or you can decrease the weight and thickness and keep the protection the same. And that's actually one of the things that's really kind of interesting, is that for some of these ships, when you go from an older class of ship to a newer class of ship, the protection doesn't actually go up. It just gets lighter. And as a result, you can spend some of that mass on guns. And at the same time, the ships are getting bigger, but even for a given tonnage, you can have more guns, which is one of the reasons why you go back and you look at some of the ships in like the 1880s, 1890s. They just have like one or two big guns. Now, part of that, of course, is the fact that there was this idea that we're going to have all these different guns at different ranges, et cetera, et cetera. But a big chunk of it was really just that, you just didn't have the mass to give to the weapon. And so once you make the armor lighter for a given level of protection, you can add more for the weapon. Okay, high seas combat. Remember how I talked about many of those ships are really only good for close to shore. And once you get to the high seas, you've got a massive increase in the amount of range between chemical propellants, which give you high velocity guns, which means they can hit really hard at long range. And scientific gunnery is the shorthand for fire control and all the other things that let you hit at range. So you end up with efficient steam engines and lighter armored. So cruisers can now have a speed advantage necessary to be scouts. For a long time, you'd think of cruisers as if you're like the French or the Germans, cruisers are going to go out and kill commerce. If you're the Brits, cruisers are going to go out and protect commerce. But it really wasn't about having them be part of the fleet battle. It was about the commerce battle. Eventually, you get to the point where they're now going to be part of the fleet battle, because now they've got the speed to actually function as the eyes of the fleet, which is what frigates did back in the Age of Sail. And then that functionality sort of went away, and you just didn't do it like that anymore. And now you end up with you've got like a 20% speed advantage is what the cruisers were able to get. And that was enough that the cruisers could actually go out, find out what's going on, and then come back and report on it. Well, an even bigger deal happens at this point. You have radio. And now they don't have to come back. They can just radio back, which in some ways, it's sort of funny the way that worked out, right? You finally get this ability that now the cruisers can go and be the eyes of the fleet again because they can be fast. And shortly after that all happens, you end up with the point where, okay, they don't really need to be that, necessarily. Speed is always good in trying to cover ground and, track down the enemy, but they don't need the speed to come back to the fleet. They can just radio it in. A couple of caveats on that, though. This is really short-range radio, 50 to 70 miles. And we're not talking about getting on the radio telephone and, Bravo Zulu, this is O'Kane, my situation, my contact report is such and such. We're talking dee, 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 dee. So we're talking Morse code. And that means that takes a while, right? Because somebody's got to come up with the message. The captain, the commanding officer has to come up with the message. Write the message down on a piece of paper. Sort of make sure you get the message right. Go take the message down to the radio room, which is maybe close by, maybe not. Depends upon what they need to do in terms of power capabilities. These are spark gap transmitters. They're big things. They're not small. And you've got all sorts of constraints on where you're going to put this stuff. So, they have to run the message down to the radio room. The radio guy has to do the Morse code. On the other end, the Morse receiver gets it. He has to write the message down and he has to call somebody, hey, take this up to the captain. He needs to see this. So when you add all that stuff up, we're not talking about getting on the radio and calling somebody and they go, Roger that, I'm going to do that. We're talking about a process that takes minutes. Now, those of you who have been to sea with the United States Navy understand that even if you got a radio telephone and you call them up and you say you're going to do X, it's harder than that. It takes a while for things to sort of churn through as a result of that. That's one of the reasons why data links are so important, and you don't have to call that stuff up. You can just sort of push the picture to the people, and they see that stuff, right? If you think back to the original series early on, Kirk and company are alone and unafraid and out there. And the only time you really see them using, sort of real-time communications early on is every now and then, there's another ship in the area and they can talk to that other ship in real time. But if they're talking back to base, it's a long distance call. Later on, they start seeming to have real-time synchronous two-way comms with Starfleet, but early on, they don't have that sort of stuff. So there's some limitations that you have in subspace radio too. We don't really see the full impact of those limitations. By the time you get to next gen and beyond, they're at the point now where I think a lot of that stuff is just being communicated over some sort of data link, right? They're seeing each other's picture. The number of times where they have to actually get on voice comms and do any sort of coordination like that seems to be relatively low. Let's see. Thus, in the late 1890s, the fleet became a blue water combat force. Its primary gun platforms could function effectively on the oceans in rough seas because they got bigger. And they were effective at 4 times the range thought possible before. Extended reconnaissance was possible using fast cruisers and wireless communication. This over-the-horizon communication link also enabled fleet commanders to disperse elements of the forces over many miles of ocean and concentrate them again at opportune moments for action. So before this time period, almost all battles took place within sight of shore, or it was just like, right over the horizon. The exception to that was the glorious 1st of June, where it was a meeting engagement between the Brits and the French, and they just stumbled upon each other in the middle of the ocean. That was next to unheard of. Now you can fight without there being any land away because you can disperse your force, you can spot each other, you can use radio to concentrate the force again, and you can do all of that at relatively high speeds, 5 or 6 times what a sailing ship could do all that stuff in. And so you can actually go out and fight in the deep ocean in a way that you couldn't do before. So, integrated systems. This is another one of those things that I don't think we see the equivalent of this in Star Trek, because in Star Trek, they've been doing it for 400 years. It's really built upon that foundation laid from 1895 on. So, they developed the guns, they developed all these other things. Eventually, they all came together in HMS Dreadnought, which led to a dramatic increase in range and destructive power. So you can shoot out twice as far as you could with the previous generation, and you can do twice as much damage while doing it. And it's all those things I talked about last time, all tied together with electrical communications. Electricity is one of those things that, sort of gets mentioned. Oh, yeah, electricity was the thing that made everything else possible. You couldn't do any of this shit until you electrified ships. You just couldn't. And like I said, most of the elements are sort of invisible to anybody except somebody who really knows what they're looking for. At this same time, destroyers joined the fleet as the first specialized fleet weapons platform. And that's because they started off with torpedo boats that were small and fast. They were small because they were trying to be stealthy, because the range of a torpedo is a lot less than the range of a gun. And so you had to not be seen as long as you could. You had to be fast and maneuverable to not get hit. That sort of meant small. Eventually, they realized, okay, with steam turbines, we can make the ships bigger and we can make them just as fast or faster, while making them bigger, and they can be a more stable platform. You still have this issue with the torpedoes outranging it, but now you can actually put them as part of a battle line. And instead of sort of saying, I'm going to have my torpedo boats do their own thing, they're now part of the fleet in deep water, in blue ocean stuff, not just near shore, and they're able to put all that stuff together and make that stuff work. And so that is a dramatic improvement. If you didn't see the last episode and you want more on this stuff, go look at episode 82, because episode 82 is really about this slide. Okay, 3 medium combat. What do I mean about that? Well, first of all, every combat was just surface combat, right? If you talk about naval combat, you talked about surface ships shooting at each other. Then you started ending up with submarines. First you got torpedoes, and you got submarines. Oh, we'll put the torpedo on the submarine. Automotive torpedoes, I should say. Like if you go back and you look at Civil War stuff, they talk about spar torpedoes or just torpedoes. And that was an explosive charge on the end of a long spear sticking out of the front of the submarine. So that was always called a torpedo. In fact, you still have torpedoes used in land combat in World War II. A torpedo charge is the charge that you use to blow a hole through a minefield. You put an explosive over it, and you could blow up mines that way. But automotive torpedoes that are capable of moving under their own power, just got shortened to torpedoes eventually. And so at that point, you've got surface and subsurface combat. And then eventually you add air into the picture. And when you get aircraft, now you've dramatically increased the range up to 10 times what you had before. And aircraft show a huge amount of potential. Submarines always had some potential, but the problem with submarines was that they were very slow. They're no faster than the surface ships, especially submerged. They're significantly slower than surface ships, and their weapons are very short range. And it's all well and good to say, you know, I'm going to hunt down enemy surface ships, but as a general rule, it really only worked for commerce raiding, or if you could put a line of submarines out someplace and sort of draw the other guy into the submarine. One of the things I learned as an anti-submarine warfare analyst working for the Center for Naval Analysis, so the right way to think of the submarine is that it's a mobile minefield. The aircraft carrier comes to the submarine, not the other way around. The submarine goes and finds a good place to wait, and it just sits there and waits for the aircraft carrier to come to it. And so you need to figure out where the aircraft carrier is and go sit there, where it's going to come. And that was because of all the restrictions on doing stuff around other ships, etc. There were certain areas where, you know, you could sort of expect that that's where they were going to come, which was fine because part of the deal is that you're training on doing anti-submarine warfare, and you have to actually detect the submarine in order to be able to do the anti-submarine warfare stuff. So it's one of those instances where it's not necessarily realistic in terms of this is how we would do it in the real world, but it's realistic from the standpoint that it puts you in situations where you can meet the training objectives. And so from that standpoint, it had the appropriate level of realism, even if in the real world, you'd be trying to avoid those interactions. Anyway, back to this. Aircraft dramatically increase the range that you can affect things at. Now, I will note, though, big ships continue to be the most effective way to do volume of fire. And there's a great graph, and I went looking for it, and I couldn't find it, that shows the volume of fire of like a battle group as a function of range. And the answer is within the first 20 miles, it's huge. It's huge. And then after 20 miles, it goes off a cliff, and you've got a relatively low capability out to about 400 miles. And that huge spike is battleship guns. And once you get outside the range of battleship guns, and it's all about just the airplanes, your ability to deliver volume of fire drops dramatically. So anyway, going back to the top of the slide. So aircraft show up, you've got new ship types, you've got submarines, aircraft carriers, you've got the specialized ships to defend against submarines and airplanes. And by that point, the concept of a single all-purpose capital ship was now quite obsolete. You go back to 1890, you got your capital ship. And what the capital ship was varied over time. There was occasionally disagreements in times of high technological change. People would have arguments about the most effective way to do it, how to put it all together, et cetera, et cetera. But you go all the way back. That's true all the way back to at least through the age of fighting sail. That a capital ship is a capital ship is a capital ship, and it's sort of like, you know, it's the capital ship. Nowadays, this is the point at which you have to start thinking in terms of everybody's a specialist at some degree. You specialize in something. You can be multi-mission, but you're not all-purpose. You can be multi-purpose, but you can't be all-purpose. You get some synergistic effects from adding some of these capabilities in, because, like, hey, you know, I could use an airplane to spot gunnery fire. I could potentially shoot my guns can shoot over the horizon. If I have an airplane up, maybe I can hit targets that I can't see, or I can't see very well. Okay, we'll do that. And as all these things changed, you had ships rapidly becoming obsolete. you had, new requirements for torpedo protection, new requirements for deck versus side armor. In World War I, most of the armor's on the side, and most of those trajectories of those shells are pretty flat because it was limited by how far out you could hit. So World War I ships doubled the range that you could hit at over the previous ships, but the guns were so powerful that they weren't shooting at their extreme range. You dial it forward to World War II, by that point, you've doubled the range again, and these guns are shooting in arcs, and as a result, they're more likely to impact on the top of the ship rather than on the sides. And so now deck armor is really important. Plus, deck armor is really what you got to worry about if somebody's dive bombing you or dropping bombs from altitude. You need torpedo protection against torpedo planes, but against bombs dropped from altitude, you really need deck armor. And those bombs for a long time just weren't as effective as a battleship shell, right? So for a long time, but the same sort of armor would protect against them. So we being the human race, took a lot of World War I designs and tried to upgrade them. The Kirishima was an upgraded World War I battlecruiser. They had turned it into a battleship, became a battleship just by they put a bunch of armor on it. Now it's slow. So now it's a battleship, but they put a bunch of deck armor on it. And so that's, the accomplishment of USS Washington in taking down Kirishima like she did. It's a fantastic accomplishment. Admiral Willis Lee is probably the best battleship sailor that the United States Navy has ever produced. He was utterly fantastic in that. He was a big proponent of radar. The comment many people make is that he probably knew how to read the radar screen better than his radar techs did. He was utterly fantastic in that battle, but he was also in like one of the newest ships that the United States Navy had produced, fighting a ship that was built in like 1920. So it really wasn't a fair fight. Now, it didn't have to be so one-sided, but it wasn't a fair fight. Aircraft capabilities, though, only really reached these limits right before the war. Like the first plane that was really capable of like carrying a decent torpedo to the ranges that you needed was really the Japanese Kate, and that plane came out in 1938. A lot of these capabilities for airplanes were just in time for the war. Now, does that mean that it was the only plane that could carry torpedoes? No. All right, you've got swordfish fighter bombers and stuff like that. Yeah, but if you're going to fight a big fleet action out in the middle of the nowhere, and you're going to put, I'm not talking about a specialty attack where you sneak up on somebody that's in a harbor or something like that. I'm talking about everybody is loaded for bear going out in the middle of the ocean. Those capabilities really only sort of came into play right before the war started. And Lautenschlager goes on to say, the first carrier battles in the Coral Sea and west of Midway Island accelerated what had been a gradual reorientation in thinking. The Battle of Midway, though, was not only a strategic turning point in the Pacific War, it precipitated a sudden change in the makeup and tactics of combat fleets. And, after the Battle of Midway, Japan cancels all battleship construction. All new battleship construction. They didn't lay anything down after that. And everybody started focusing on aircraft carriers, and everybody started focusing on how to defend against air attacks. And it really became more about the air attacks. Now, I'm not saying that they weren't looking for gun battles. They were. Everybody was prepared for a gun battle, but they sort of understood that if you want to affect things at range, you need to use airplanes to do it. Okay, integrated sensor grids, and I think this is the last one, if I remember correctly. So you've got, as you move forward into the modern era, you've got computerized data links that link your sensor, wherever it is, to the rest of the platform. So like you've got a radar, you've got an airplane or whatever, like you might have an AWACS that's out, and it is passing targeting information, tracking information, let's be specific, tracking information down to a surface ship or something. So, and you might be passing, and you'll vector an airplane off in that direction based upon this. So you've got data links between the sensor and the platform. You got data links between the platform and the weapon. So the weapon gets fired and you're updating the core, you're steering the weapon. And then you've also got data links between platforms. So ships can talk to each other. They can pass information back and forth to each other. Now, it does not work the way that you think it does. And it's only recently gotten to the point where it started working the way that you think it does. Cooperative engagement capability with Aegis ships, I always describe it as it makes a data link work the way that you always thought a data link should work. You can't, it's only recent that you're able to start targeting off of other people's tracks. You'd have track quality data, you wouldn't have targeting quality data. What's the difference? Track quality data is the equivalent of saying, look over there. I'm pointing at something, right? And so you've got your binoculars, you see me, I point over at at a place on the tree line, you can bring your binoculars up and you can look at that spot and you can see the thing that I saw. Targeting quality data is the equivalent of me saying, okay, lift your binoculars a little bit, over to the left a little bit, over to the right a little bit, et cetera, and being able to sort of drill right down in on that. And that's hard. That's hard. And plus, you're doing that in a situation where if I'm in one Aegis ship and you're in another Aegis ship, I'm not just passing you the data from my radars to let you take the shot. You've got to process it and take into account our relative positions and adjust accordingly. And so that's hard. You end up, at the same time, you got more complex battle management taking place. Like the battles are moving much faster. You're having to pass information around a lot faster. You're having to get orders out to people faster. You're having to understand the situation faster. All that's very complex. And that also requires better communications and command and control and all the rest of that stuff. So you have to see a picture that extends out a lot farther. And then you've just got other things that are part of that you have to be good at in order to make the rest of this work. So sometimes you'll hear people talk about PNT. I think the official definition is position, navigation, and timing. I'm one of the people that thinks that it should be, there's a handful of us that think that it really should be precision, navigation, and timing for two reasons. One, can't navigate if you don't know your position, so it's already implied. And two, the thing that makes modern PNT different is the precision of it. It's that everybody's got the same time signal, so you can synchronize stuff to the degree that you need to synchronize it, and you can get very precise coordinates, and so that makes it a lot easier for you to fire the weapon off of my track in a way that you couldn't do before. The precision, it was what makes it happen. We've always had navigation and timing. So what's so different that it now gets its own warfare area? The difference is the precision. And a new phrase that you hear every now and then is talks about kill webs as opposed to kill chains, because kill chains are usually like you got this sensor and you got this data link, etc. And the idea behind the kill web is more along the lines of you got a lot of different sensors out there, and you should be able to put that out there and not have to link the sensor to shooter that tightly. You should be able to just sort of like, here's the sensor information, shooters have at it. And so that's hard to do. If you think about it, though, a lot of this stuff, this really kind of sounds like stuff that you see in Star Trek all the time. In fact, this is one of those things that's sort of hard to assess exactly because I think they just do it. They don't really talk about it. You don't really see the development of that much. Okay. So what did we learn from all this? And this is a slide that I used from last week also. So, and actually it's the thing I did at the very beginning. Yeah, I think it's the same. It's the same quote. So I'm not going to go ahead and repeat it, but that's what we learned from all of this. Systems integration is often the key, and important changes may be subtle to detect. So let's look at this compared to Starfleet. Auto maneuver stuff. In the real world, you got steam engines and screw propellers, which gives you tactical mobility and strategic mobility. I've already talked about impulse drives and warp drives. Is that sort of the same thing? Maybe you can make the argument that, you can sort of look at it in that way. I don't think it's exactly the same thing, but you can look at it in that way. Fuel is potentially a limited concern, but it's a limited concern from the standpoint that they seem to have fuel that lasts a long time. But they do occasionally talk about antimatter fuel just doesn't come from nowhere, right? It's expensive. It requires a lot of tanking. It requires some capability to sort of top off the tanks, et cetera, et cetera. And so, fuel is potentially important. Excuse me. So long-range weapons. Starfleet, Star Trek in general, you've got photon torpedoes and phasers, things that look like phasers, things that look like photon torpedoes by and large. You do have this migration from hull plating to shields, and so shields are more effective than hull plating. That's actually something that I have on my list of things to do, that the next time I go back and watch Enterprise, I want to do like a complete watch through of all 700 plus episodes of Star Trek. As part of that, though, thinking about that in terms of hull plating to shields, I want to sort of try to get an idea about whether phase cannons to hull plating is the equivalent of phasers to shields. You always run into the problem that you do with all of this, which is, which Star Trek and all the implications of it being a TV show. I'm not, I've never been convinced that the writers were particularly paying attention to all that stuff. I think Sternbach and Okuda pay attention to that stuff. I don't think any of the rest of them do. We just don't simply see a lot of this history in Star Trek. And there's a lot of stuff that should be there that you see developing over time that you just really don't. You see a little bit of that in Enterprise as they upgrade stuff over time, but it's usually just in terms of, now we got these phase cannon things, and you don't see like sort of the data network stuff that I kind of like to see. I don't think that there's really a Starfleet equivalent of high seas combat. You don't really see anything where they're sort of like limited, and then they can go out and start having fights in deep space. In fact, if anything, you sort of see it the other way. Sort of get the impression, in the original series that they're doing meeting engagements in deep space, but as a general rule, in Next Gen, things usually seem to take place around planets, because that's where people come out of warp. I've always thought that the combat in Next Gen on, there's a few things about it that don't quite gel for me. And that's actually probably worthy of an episode in and of itself. So integrated systems, I'm not sure that there's a gunnery equivalent of that in Star Trek. It's also sort of a little weird from the standpoint that a lot of the ships that we see in Star Trek are not specialized warships. The Starfleet ships are not specialized warships. They certainly can function as warships. Worf, when he's on the amnesiac Worf, says, well, we're clearly on a battleship, right? But there's a lot of other stuff there as well. And so it's not immediately clear to me about what the specialization, what it would look like if it was a specialized warship in terms of increased capabilities along those lines. And a lot of it's just, the computer can do everything. So a lot of that data integration stuff that used to be done with human beings and protractors and paper and pen and voice comms and stuff like that got turned into electronic comms and data links, and has since been turned into more sophisticated data links. A lot of that stuff just seems to happen behind the scenes. You don't really talk about it. I think there's a fundamental mismatch when you start talking about 3-medium combat, because there's space. You don't have undersea. You don't have, if you remember going back to some of the things that I've done previously, I talk about how I think I did aircraft carriers in space. If not, I really need to. I talk about how airplanes only make sense because air is different than water. An airplane is a platform optimized for air, and a ship is a platform optimized for water. And an aircraft carrier, the flight deck of an aircraft carrier, is the doorway between the sea and the sky. It lets an airplane act like a ship, and that it lets it come aboard the ship and sort of be in the ship realm. And so you don't really have an equivalent of that. You might be able to argue, if you squint hard enough, that combat at warp versus combat at impulse has some elements of being in different medium. It certainly has different restrictions, the inability to use phasers and the differences in how warp stuff happens. One of the things that I miss in the later shows that you see in the original series, you see high-speed passes at warp, combat that takes place with ships zooming past each other at high warp factors. I don't recall anything in Next Gen, any combat in Next Gen that was at warp that wasn't a one ship chasing another ship. I could be wrong about that. Could very definitely be wrong about that. As far as integrated sensor grids, I think all the stuff that the U.S. Navy is finally putting into operation, that and then some is sort of like the default of what Starfleet does. They wouldn't understand a world where you didn't have all the capabilities that we're just now beginning to develop. So I think that's kind of how that goes. Okay. So what do we see in other science fiction? So auto maneuver, you do see various settings like Traveler, etc., that have a maneuver drive and a jump drive. And so that's kind of the strategic mobility versus tactical mobility. If you've got warp points, then it adds some geography on top of that, which makes it even more interesting. So I think we do see those sorts of things. And you can, if you're into Traveler, you can easily imagine situations where you've got ships that are designed that with crappy jump drives, because they're really just intended to be mobile forts that can move from one system to another, and they've got crappy jump drives. But you could also imagine having good jump drives and crappy maneuver drives. In fact, we see that in the X-boats, which admittedly not warships, just communication ships, but they basically have no maneuver drive. They just jump back and forth carrying messages. For long-range weapons, Honor Harrington explicitly looks at weapon range increases and how doctrine and tactics change over time. High seas combat, you've got jump drive versus monitors versus system defense boats and Traveler. That's sort of a staple of, if you've got something that requires a separate jump drive, you can put more pounds, and it's not useful in combat. You can put more pounds of capability. You can use that extra mass that you're not wasting on a jump drive to increase the capability. In Traveler, if you've got two ships of the same tech level and one and the same mass, one has a jump drive and the other one doesn't. The one that doesn't have the jump drive has the advantage because it's got a lot more capability for fighting. Integrated systems, I think there's few instances where you see this stand out. You sort of see some of that in Honor Harrington because David's very aware of this stuff and thinks about this stuff. You're much more likely in science fiction to see, hey, we got this new gun and it's going to change everything. So it's much more the revolutionary changes lead the revolutionary changes. So that's kind of how that works. Let's see. 3-medium combat, fundamentally a different model. Integrated sensor grid, sometimes you get that with things like Honor Harrington. So there's specifically some of that takes place in there. So there's a few comments I wanted to go through. Let's see. Let me take a look at a couple of things. Somebody made the comment about unmanned systems being the way to go. Unmanned systems are really interesting. The U.S. Navy is talking about having unmanned surface ships that go around and tool around for a couple of months at a time. And I've always thought, A, that's really cool. B, what about maintenance? We've tried minimally manned ships and they generally failed because they didn't have a crew. So the solution to that is to get rid of all the crew. Now, admittedly, the unmanned ships are a lot simpler than, say, LCSs. But it's still a situation where, like, okay, things that would be a minor thing that I can go and fix end up turning into a cascading failure if you don't have somebody there. Unmanned aircraft are different, right? Because you only have to expect those things to work for, okay, let's just say 2 days, right? For predators, it's a lot less than that, but it might only just be a short amount of time. I can come up with something that I can keep in the air for 2 days. Keeping something working without anything breaking for 2 months would be really, really hard. Okay, somebody said I hit the nail on the head with the last statement. Don't remember what statement that was. Let's see. Yeah, somebody made the comment about Link 16 being in operation and constantly upgraded. So you get Link 16 gives you the ability to pass track data back and forth. It doesn't by itself give you the ability to shoot off those targets. It gives you the ability to point your own radar at a particular place and see it with your own radar, but you need cooperative engagement capability to pass ship data back and forth. And then there's something that they're working to integrate the air side of things called NIFCA, Naval Integrated Fire Control Counter Air. And the idea is that your E2 Hawkeye can send targeting data to your Aegis surface ship, and the Aegis can shoot a weapon at an air target without ever turning on its radar, which is just a fantastic capability. Let's see. Comment was Okuda was clearly second in the food chain to the writers. Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, Okuda was primarily like an inside the ship guy, and Sternbach was kind of more of the outside the ship guy for that stuff. And so for combat stuff, it's more about the outside the ship guy. Yeah, let's see. I'm going through. Let's see what else we got. Yeah, Bob made a comment about when it ever becomes fully operational. I think he's referring there, I could be wrong, but I think he's referring to the idea that it's track quality data and not targeting quality data. I haven't actually read those specs, and what little study I did of Link 16, I did 10 plus years ago. At one point, I really did kind of pay some attention to that. It's actually pretty cool. Let's see. Yep, somebody made the Alam said Bangalore torpedoes about the anti-mine torpedoes. And so Logix Finance asks the question, is it true that a submerged World War II submarine only did 5 knots top speed and most did 3 knots? Yeah, that's about right. And the other thing is, you can go faster, but if you do, you wear your batteries down a lot faster. And the charge in your batteries is what allows you to stay under. So the speed improvement that you got wasn't going to be that great anyway. So you really kind of didn't want to go any faster than that if you could absolutely avoid it, because you're just going to run down your battery so much faster. So Bob says, reminds me of the Japanese advantage over the Russian fleet back in 1905. They had roughly the same capabilities, but the Japanese operational effectiveness was vastly superior to the Russians. Yeah, there's a couple of other things going on there. So Roger all, but there's a couple of other things going on. First of all, the Russians, of course, had just done for the Battle of Tsushima, they had just done this huge transit. So those ships were rode hard and put away wet by the time they got there. The second thing is a lot of those ships, Russian naval architecture was problematic. They were doing things like they weren't constraining the weight growth of their ships. And so they'd build the armor belt. They designed the ship with the armor belt in a particular location because you wanted the armor belt right at the water line, right? Because the water line is the most dangerous place for 2 reasons. One is that shells have a tendency to skip. So there's a lot of times a shell that was short would actually hit you at the water line. And the water line is the place where if you get hit at the water line, the water comes in. That's the place that it's easiest for your opponent to poke a hole in your ship that's actually going to hurt you. If it's way up high, you know, it might do some damage, but you're not going to sink from getting hit up high. So the Russians did things like they designed their ship with the armored belt right at the waterline, and then the ship just kept getting heavier and heavier and heavier as they failed to exercise any discipline in what they were putting on the ship. And it would get heavier and the armor belt would get lower and lower. And in some cases it got, not only did it just, the amount coverage went down, in some cases it got to the point where the entire belt was submerged. So at that point, the entire belt submerged. There's no point in even having an armored belt at that point. All it does is add mass. So the Russians just weren't very good about that stuff. The Russians in general are not particularly good at surface ship design. They just really haven't been. Okay. All right. So I'm going back, and I think I'm back to pretty close to the beginning of the show. So, and it's 10 after. So I think it's probably time to declare victory. And go ahead and call it a night, everybody. So, Lissa, do you want to come back on for a second? I thought I would just come on and ask you how the game's going.
It's going all right. We're playing hide and seek right now.
Ah. Well, hopefully they're not looking at YouTube, because if they were, you're right there. I can see you. You're right there.
Yeah, we're in a pickle. Like, we're trying not to get killed.
Not getting killed is a good thing. Big fan of not getting killed. Big fan.
I don't know where my task is. I'm not familiar with this map. Oh, God.
All right. Well,
oh, no. Oh, no. The killers.
Does this mean you're not winning?
No, it means I'm about to die. I'm dead.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. I'm sorry to hear that. So I did want to ask you, the last time we talked the last time that we talked and everybody else heard us, you had just been diagnosed with COVID, right?
Yeah, I took an at-home test and failed it.
Yeah. Okay. So you're, but that was, 3 weeks ago. So are you?
Yeah.
You're back to normal?
Yep.
Okay. So my brother Sean, not Delon, who's on tonight. Hi, Delon. Our brother Sean currently has COVID. The boss's boss currently has COVID. One of my coworkers just found out that he's been exposed, so he's coming back home and is going to take a test when he gets home, but he doesn't know if he's got it yet.
Boy.
So we continue, and I still don't know if Stogie's had it. If Stogie has had it, it means that I'm like the last one.
Yeah, you would be the holdout.
I would be the holdout. So I'm doing the sort of, the witness relocation program thing and not going around anybody. Hiding from the virus.
Yes.
Instead of the mob, I'm hiding from the virus. Actually, I'm not hiding from the virus. I go and I spend time with people all the time because my job requires it. But
I mean, happens. It happens.
Yeah, it does. And some people have severe cases and some have less.
I was lucky. I did not have a severe case. Jesus Christ, there's still a lot of bodies around. In Among Us, if you didn't know, after you die, you can still go around as a ghost completing tasks.
Oh, well, that's convenient.
So that way it's not so lopsided to the killers.
What game is this again?
It's called Among Us.
Okay.
Here, I could actually share my screen.
Oh, okay. Why don't you do that for just a second?
You go around completing tasks, and right now one of my tasks is right here. Okay. Or not. I could have sworn I just finished that. Yeah, no, I finished that. It's glitching.
Well, you are a ghost.
I am indeed a ghost. But as a ghost, you now no longer have to deal with walls. So
that would be
that is nice. But yeah, that's what I've been doing. Where is the stop sharing? There we go.
So, oh well. All right, we should probably call it.
Yes.
I'm beginning to run out of steam.
All right, guys. We love you. Live long and prosper, and we will see you next week. Yes, Chris?
Yeah, I think so. I think let's plan on doing a Q&A question session last week. I think the last one we did went well, and I've done a couple of like 2 or 3 sessions since then. So let's just do bring your questions and we'll talk. If Pat's aboard next week, we may do something different. And as I've said, I have plans where I'm going to invite other people on the show, et cetera, et cetera. I've just been so swamped with other stuff. One of the things I need to do to make that happen is to just sort of sit back with a notebook and a pen and sort of plan stuff out. And finding both the time and the energy at the same time has been difficult. So, but I'm gonna make that happen. So
awesome.
Now I may be in Des Moines. There's a good chance that I'm gonna, in fact, Delon, FYI, I may be coming to Des Moines on Friday, in which case we'll do the show from your house if you're going to be around. Or if you're not going to be around, I can do the show from your house. So, because
I mean, fair enough.
Yeah. So, but we'll figure it all out. So, all right, everybody. Thank you very much. See you next time.
Bye.